Hello and welcome. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called Afghan President Ashraf Ghani to express disappointment over the postponement of talks with the Taliban and to condemn the insurgent group's recent announcement of a spring offensive. Some 250 Afghan politicians and civil society figures had been due to meet with Taliban negotiators in Doha starting on April 19th for the intra-Afghan dialogue. It would have marked the first time that Taliban and the Kabul government officials sat together. But the meetings were abruptly cancelled on April 18th amid disagreements about the size and composition of the Afghan delegation. The U.S. State Department said in a statement that Pompeo called Ghani on April 21st and condemned the Taliban's announcement of starting another offensive in the spring. Pompeo also said that the talks present an important opportunity to advance peace. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the Afghan peace talks. Joining me on the program today are Prabhu Dayal, former ambassador, Professor Swaran Singh, School of International Studies, JNU, and Major General Ashwini Sivach, retired strategic affairs expert. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. Your thoughts on the abrupt cancellation of the talks between both the parties, the Taliban and the government in Kabul?
Well, as you rightly mentioned in your introductory remarks, the talks were cancelled because of the Taliban's objection to the size and composition of the official Afghan delegation. The size of this delegation was going to be 250, which the Taliban said is too large, too unwieldy, because I think they were objecting to the presence of some Afghan leaders in that delegation. And not surprisingly, the Taliban got support from the host, the government of Qatar. Now, this cancellation and this sort of objection by the Taliban is only symptomatic of the larger divide which exists between the Taliban on one hand and the government in Kabul led by Ashraf Ghani on the other. As you would recall, the Taliban have not recognized the government in Kabul and they have repeatedly termed it illegitimate. They have refused to have direct talks with the Afghan government all along. And in fact, the American government, when it wanted to have talks with the Taliban, it had to agree to exclude the Ashraf Ghani-led government. So, therefore, the Americans and the Russians to that extent too have bent backwards to accommodate the Taliban because of the fact that there is a feeling that if the government in Kabul were to be brought to the table, then the Taliban would not be prepared to sit there, and therefore, despite the protests and the demands by Ashraf Ghani to have a seat at the table at the talks between the United States and the Taliban, he has been denied that seat. Now, the biggest rogue in this entire drama is the government of Pakistan and the ISI, because they have given unstinted support to the Taliban, arming it to the teeth and allowing it to play the role of a rogue. Without the support from Pakistan, perhaps the Taliban would have been willing to come to the table on a more flexible basis. But their position has been very rigid because they are being used by Pakistan, they are being armed by Pakistan to play the role of a spoiler. Now, already the Taliban is in control of something like 50% of the territory of Afghanistan. The urban areas are said to be within the control of the Kabul government, but the rural areas and the far-flung areas are really all under the Taliban's control. So in this sort of a situation, since the Americans have been saying that they would be very keen to withdraw. In fact, President Trump had made it a sort of a campaign promise that he would withdraw US forces from Afghanistan. This sort of a premature announcement relating to the intention to withdraw, if anything, strengthens the position of the Taliban because they know that the Americans want an exit route. And if they want an exit route, then the Taliban will try to have that exit on their own terms.
Absolutely.
And certainly that weakens the position of the government in Kabul.
Right.
So the scenario is one where there are many roadblocks. The Pakistan government, the obstinacy and the obduracy of the Taliban, the somewhat weak position in which the government in Kabul finds itself, and of course, above everything else, the strategic nature of the region, where even other actors like Iran and Russia are helping the Taliban to dig in and becoming spoilers to the peace process.
Right, right.
Because Ashraf Ghani has been asking for an inclusive sort of inclusive talks, Afghan-led, Afghan-owned and Afghan-controlled. But really speaking, unless Pakistan can be made to push back, these talks are never going to be Afghan-controlled, because Pakistan will play the spoiler.
Absolutely. So what is the ground reality, General? How long can the Afghan government, continue to persist on this, Afghan-centric peace process? Because the Taliban is getting stronger day by day, and there are several other players in this particular region, like the ambassador just pointed out.
Frank, one, we have to understand that as far as Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan is playing a central role. Pakistan is a frontline state. It is playing a double game. It is showing to the America that they are forcing the Taliban to come on the negotiating table. And of course, they have helped pressurizing Taliban to talk with the Americans. At the same time, it is also putting pressure on Taliban not to agree for the Afghan government to be also on the same table. So it is what Pakistan playing a double game, which known to everyone. Because Pakistan aim is that whichever government come in Afghanistan should be totally under control of Pakistan. And therefore, it is become a strategic depth to Pakistan. So this is what it is working, and this is the one which is the roadblock in finding a negotiating a solution to Afghanistan. As far as Taliban is concerned, they are now taking a very strong step. They are saying that they are not going to speak to the Afghanistan government officially. Now, this is a sort of a solution which have been found out, that unofficially let them have a talk, the 250 delegation other than the government officials and the Taliban governments can then have sort of discussion and come to some sort of a negotiation, and whatever the points where they are not agreeing, at least they are reduced. So that is what it is, not making any impact on the actual official talk between Taliban and the American government. Now the problem which is coming is that Taliban is not ready to speak to the Afghan government officially, and therefore any solution which is coming in Afghanistan can be skewed. Can be a very short term. It may not be long term. Now this is the point which has to be realized by other countries like Russia, China, Iran and India, that how do you ensure that the solution which comes in Afghanistan is long enduring? Because America is very keen to get out from Afghanistan, especially before 2020 when the elections have to take place, and any solution which will be found will not be to the interest of Afghanistan. It will be totally Taliban controlled, and therefore the Taliban will be the one which will be governing.
Right.
And this is which we are objecting it. India stands to lose the maximum in this thing. That point we must understand that
sure,
there are
we'll
two
come to that. We'll come to India's role and what India stands to lose really in Afghanistan if things go south. But before that, Professor, so as far as the talks itself are concerned, the peace process that is in place, are they going to be conducive at any point in time, or do you believe that when the Taliban is speaking from a position of strength, everyone will have to listen to the Taliban at some point in time?
I think Afghanistan presents a fairly complex situation, and we have seen Soviet Union trying its hands, and now Americans are trying their hands for 18 years. The most important player in Afghanistan is United States, which is apparently frustrated, exhausted. It came in 2001 to remove Taliban regime, and it is now talking to them. That means it's not been effective solution the way they originally planned it. Taliban is the second most important player in Afghanistan today. About 50% of land in their control. They are on the winning spree, as you just mentioned. And United States exhausted, trying to get as soon as possible to exit from Afghanistan. Then there is a government, which is the sovereign government of Afghanistan. Ashraf Ghani is the president. He was supposed to end his tenure next month. He's been just given a lease up to 28th of September. And then Pakistan, which is facilitating United States and Taliban negotiations. Now, what happened in 5 rounds of negotiations between the special envoy of United States for Afghan reconciliation, Zalmay Khalilzad, who's a Afghan-born former ambassador to Afghanistan, a certain amount of understanding that we need to talk was built. And then November, Russia, Moscow organized another meeting where Taliban for the first time met all other stakeholders from Afghanistan minus the government. Now, this was supposed to be next step this weekend, which just passed, that the Doha office of Taliban was supposed to host a meeting with all other stakeholders of Afghanistan, including the government, with a condition that those who will represent the government will go there as individual citizens of Afghanistan. And that is what was breached very clearly, because Ashraf Ghani wanted to showcase the national unity, convened Loya Jirga, 2,500 members of it, to generate a national view of how this delegation would engage with the Taliban, which is not how it was supposed to be. Indeed, several of the members of the delegation have said that, without being quoted by name, that they received calls from President's office saying that please do not, feel free and talk your individual opinion when you go there. There has to be a national view. You have to take a state view, which is not what Taliban had agreed upon. So in that sense, now so much so that after extension up to 28th of September for President, his special envoy, Doodzai, is saying that elections are not on negotiating table. So he's already put a condition. So it's not only that there is an attempt to breach the trust of Taliban to say that we will speak there as a state, but to also put a precondition that, elections will be held on time, and that's not negotiable.
But going by the Taliban's track record, can the Taliban be trusted?
I'm not saying Taliban can be trusted here, but the issue on which Taliban had finally agreed to have a direct negotiation with the government, which is on the losing side, is a weak wicket government, has been breached by the same government in that sense. So I'm not saying this is end of the tunnel. I'm sure you will see now Khalilzad again planning his 20-day trip to several countries to build that consensus again. At some point in time, they'll start talking again. Truth is, the Taliban is a force to reckon with today. And you cannot push them, ignore them, and, breach trust.
Away.
You can't wish them away. You can't also breach trust with them. You have to take them in confidence, give them a certain space, and I think some kind of national government has to come about.
Right, right. So, that having been said, Ambassador, what's the way out really as far as this entire issue in Afghanistan is concerned? Because like the professor was pointing out, the aim of the United States was to get rid of the Taliban in 2001. But now it seems like, the Taliban is back in Afghanistan and back with a bang.
As Professor Swaran Singh rightly said, there is a lack of trust which prevails among the different parties. The Taliban doesn't trust the government in Kabul. In fact, it calls it illegitimate. On the other hand, the government in Kabul doesn't trust the Taliban at all, because it sees the Taliban as a proxy of the Pakistan government. And neither the Taliban nor the government in Kabul is fully trusting the Americans, because the Americans have their own agenda. Particularly the Trump-led American administration wants to leave Afghanistan, to pull out their troops from Afghanistan. The government in Kabul is naturally not happy, because it would leave them extremely vulnerable to the Taliban, which are so heavily supported by Pakistan. So there is a complete trust deficit which is prevailing, even to the extent that the American envoy to these talks, Khalilzad, is not trusted by the government in Kabul, because there are rumors and reports that he wants to be a candidate for the presidency himself. So in this sort of atmosphere, the first thing is to build trust. And I think the Americans could have played a pivotal role in this regard, but what they ended up doing was putting the cart before the horse. They first announced their intention to withdraw, but once that intention is known, their ability to play a serious role, a strong role in any sort of talks with the Taliban gets considerably reduced. I think now the time is for the Americans to avoid succumbing to the pressure of the Taliban, because the Taliban wants them to announce the date of their withdrawal as a precondition to talking seriously with the government in Kabul. The Americans should hold back on that account, because that would weaken the peace process, and that would weaken this entire idea of an inclusive dialogue relating to Afghanistan between the Afghan parties themselves. The government in Kabul has to be supported by all right-thinking parties, because nobody in their right minds, except the Pakistanis, wants a return to the 1990s, when the Taliban had the most abhorrent sort of rule in that country. Women in particular in Afghanistan are staunchly opposed to giving the Taliban that sort of role which they had played in Afghanistan in the decade of the 90s.
Right.
So I think that, as I said, all right-thinking people have to come together and work out an arrangement where the Taliban would not be able to have unbridled control over power in Afghanistan. In other words, Pakistan would not be able to have its sway in the manner in which things are unfolding,
Sure.
but rather that there should be a reasonable arrangement worked out in which all parties in Afghanistan play a role. Unfortunately, we are getting a little marginalized in that context,
Right.
very frankly.
Right.
The role which India could have played and should have played perhaps has not been played, and I think we should perhaps be more assertive, because our stakes in Afghanistan are so
high.
much.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just come to that. Before that, General, as far as the region itself is concerned, and as far as Afghanistan is concerned, of what strategic importance is Afghanistan, and why is everyone so interested in what's happening in Afghanistan?
As on today, Frank, that Afghanistan is very important to in Central Asia, very important to Pakistan, very important to Iran, very important to Russia, very important to China. So it has become almost a frontline state for everyone. The reasons are very obvious. As far as Pakistan is concerned, it gives them a strategic depth. As far as Russia is concerned, it is north-south corridor is passing through that. The China is concerned, the China is worried about the Xinjiang province, which is a Muslim-dominated area. They do not want any problem to come either from Pakistan or Afghanistan in that area. As far as Iran is concerned, the Charbar is there. Their gateway to Central Asian states are through Afghanistan now. So therefore, as far as Afghanistan is concerned, it plays a major role. And everyone likes the government which should come there, should be a pro to that nation. So that is a very important thing which is there. And as on today, what America is trying to do it, that it is in hurry to vacate Afghanistan. It will now leave Afghanistan in much more chaos than what it is. You see what is happening in the spring offensive which has been declared by Taliban is going in a big hog and big this thing, getting success after success. They have already taken 50% of area. They will be in a more dominating position on a negotiating table. Islamic State is also now trying to get a foothold. The recent strike which has taken place on that communication center was the signature of Islamic State. So therefore the point which is coming is, if America is in hurry to vacate Afghanistan, they will leave Afghanistan in chaos. And this is not good, not only for India, even for the region around it, except Pakistan. So this point must be understood, ki how do we ensure that the Americans take their time, let the thing stabilize, do
Right.
not succumb to the pressure of Taliban. The point which is coming is, Taliban is telling, give us the date by which the Americans will leave Afghanistan. And they are in return promising that the soil of Afghanistan will never be utilized by jihadi group. Now this issue cannot be ascertained, because once the Americans leave Afghanistan, then what role is left, what leverage is left? So therefore, Taliban will be all over Afghanistan, and then it will govern the way it want to govern. So therefore the actors and characters, it is not only Taliban and America, it is a requirement of all other negotiators like Russia, China, Iran, India should also play a role in this. What is happening is India is totally marginalized.
Right.
What are we waiting for? We are one of the biggest donor in Afghanistan. Our investment is one of the highest in this area. We are the one which have made a road and rail ring going from Iran through Afghanistan to Central Asian state. We have invested in infrastructure development. We have invested in capacity building. And overnight you will find a government which is coming there is totally anti-India. Have we forgotten those Taliban days? So India interest is not been guarded. We have to ensure that, how do we ensure that our interest is guarded? If we can't directly speak, then let us go through the American.
Right.
But understanding the psyche of Americans, I don't think they are interested in someone else's interest, their own interest, which is to leave Afghanistan at the earliest. So India has to ensure, in case Americans leave Afghanistan, what is the implication of them leaving in hurry? One is that our infrastructure as well as our capacity will be all exposed.
Sure.
The second thing which is very important is the Taliban which is there, which are used in fighting, and all of a sudden they have to govern this. There is a chance of these Taliban mujahid coming toward POK and then coming to Jammu and Kashmir.
Absolutely,
a
right.
threat is very live. So all these issues are alive to India. We must play
Sure.
a major role. Why are we not pushing our case?
Let me take the points that you're making to the other panelists as well. Professor, so what should India do really, and how can India be an important player on the ground in Afghanistan as well? There is tremendous goodwill for us. There are several projects that have been started by us. How do we safeguard those projects? Should we work in collaboration with someone else? Maybe, extend the olive leaf or olive branch to the Chinese and maybe have some kind of a joint collaboration in Afghanistan there, and then hope that our relationship between India and China too improves in the process.
I think there's no denying the fact that all stakeholders are working for their national interest. So as General said, United States number one aim is that as they exit, they want to at least get a simple promise that once Taliban is in power, either partially or fully, they will not allow that soil to be used for any anti-American activities, which we cannot trust, as General said. As regards India, India's stakes, India is completely anchored on President Ashraf Ghani. And I think that is our limitation today, because if Ashraf Ghani is getting sidelined and marginalized, so are India's interests. If you notice, even Khalilzad, he came to Delhi in January, part of Raisina dialogue. Throughout March, he's been traveling, he's not come to Delhi. Maybe now he's supposed to come to Delhi during the Six Nation trip at end of it. Both Ashraf Ghani is getting sidelined, marginalized, and therefore India is getting marginalized. I think it's a difficult choice to make. India has been very clear of not recognizing any moderate Talibans and not engaging them. I think there was some kind of an informal, indirect possibility in Moscow conference. If Taliban is going to be at least partially or fully in command of government in Afghanistan, look back the experience of 1990s, as my panelists said, abhorrent kind of regime that they had during early 1990s. That was the reason why India had immediately supported and recognized Northern Alliance in 2001, even when they had only 10% of Afghan territory under their control at that time. So we understand that we cannot allow Taliban to be uncontested. And then, of course, it increases the influence of Pakistan in that case. What can we do in this? If United States is trying to pull out its cards as soon as possible, they may not be the most reliable partner for us. And as you yourself said, maybe China, Russia, Iran. We have excellent relations with all three countries. Indeed, for the first time last October, China and India held their first, what they call 2+1 model, joint training of Afghan diplomats. India and China have already demonstrated a possibility of doing something for Afghanistan together. We could also likewise work with, for example, Iran and Russia.
Right.
So basically, the international and regional stakes have to be highlighted. Their coordination has to be improvised, because internally, the violence and the fight between Ashraf Ghani and Taliban is going very clearly in favor of Taliban. And United States is not interested in stabilizing and building a long-term peace there. They want to exit. So who are the other stakeholders? I think it's the immediate neighboring nations, except Pakistan, because their interests are in contradiction to us. So I think basically, as you mentioned, Iran, Russia, China, India, that kind of coordination has to increase to build that regional pressure. so that Taliban is kept in control, though they are going to be part of some kind of an arrangement in future. We can't deny that.
Right. 3 minutes left on the program. Quick closing comments from all my guests, starting first with the ambassador. So, what's the option really as far as India is concerned? Start talking with the Taliban. Could that be one option?
Well, as the fellow panelist, Dr. Swaran Singh mentioned, we must have a dialogue on a serious note with China and Russia. But at the same time, it's very important to try convincing the Americans about the folly of withdrawing from Afghanistan in such a situation. Because the imprint of the Islamic State and other very strong Islamic forces which work against stability is only going to grow. The recent events in Sri Lanka have shown that the footprint of the Islamic State is growing everywhere. And I think it would be very unwise for the Americans to leave Afghanistan at the mercy of the Pakistani-backed Taliban, because they may promise that they are not going to let the territory of Afghanistan be used for waging attacks led by the Islamic State. But who can believe them?
Sure.
I personally don't. And I think that it's very important that the Taliban should be kept out of power in Afghanistan.
Right.
Because if they are allowed to have a foot in, they will completely try to knock the other party out.
Right. Generally, we've spoken a lot about Taliban on the program, but what about the Islamic State? Because the Islamic State too has got a considerable presence in Afghanistan now.
You know, there is no denying the Islamic State is slowly taking a foothold. What is happening is that Islamic State is totally marginalized in Syria and Iraq. But the ideology stays. And this is now spreading in the other parts of the world, and especially South Asia. What they said is those fighters which have been defeated in Iraq and Syria, now they should go back to their parent country and fight it out there. So therefore, the danger is looming large, and we as an Indian should also not close the eyes on that. It is in Afghanistan, it has happened in Sri Lanka, it is happening in southern other southeastern states. So the threat is live. Now, as far as this point which was there, Frank, that whom all we should cooperate as far as Afghanistan is concerned, there is no denying the fact the countries which we can depend upon are Russia, Iran, and to some extent China. China is also interested that peace should prevail in Afghanistan, because China-Pakistan economic corridor is passing very close to Afghanistan border.
Right. And
they do not want the Bluchis to then hijack this issue. So to some extent, China also want a peace to prevail in Afghanistan.
Sure.
So therefore, what we are trying to do is that we are not still being very assertive. We should be assertive as Indians and also cooperate with other countries and become a partner in finding a solution in Afghanistan rather than basically a side watcher.
Right. Professor, close the show for us with a quick concluding remark.
I think history tells us that Americans repeatedly have had this isolationist impulse, and they are trying to bring the boys home now. And in doing that, not just United States, but China, Russia, Iran also are looking for what is called one-to-one kind of an arrangement, promises from a Taliban which can't be trusted at all. And that point has to be asserted repeatedly, that we remember 1990s, violence went up in Chechnya, in Xinjiang, in Kashmir, and of course we saw what happened in 9/11. So these myopic understandings of building personal promises with Taliban, with each of these countries working in their own silos, is not going to be at all effective. I think therefore, I think the calibration of regional powers and the United States has to ensure certain kind of restraint. India's approach is Afghan-led, Afghan-controlled, and humanitarian, basic human rights to be recognized there.
Right.
18 years of our work recognized there. Calibration of regional stakeholders is important at this stage to look long-term rather than short-term gains.
All right, look long-term rather than short-term gains is what the panelists are suggesting, and that's what we need to see really as far as Afghanistan is concerned. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.